Hi folks, okay, so this tutorial is just going to basically run through um, the situation where on your report you have split the mark into a class mark and an exam mark, and you enter the class mark. Traditionally you entered the class mark into the term 2 or report display 2 column, and the exam mark into the term 5 or report display 5 column. So in actual fact, what you're doing is you're not sending the report mark that you generate on your mark sheets through to the term 2 column in FrontOFFICE, which for those that only show a term 2 mark on the report, which is in fact the final term 2 mark, they just put a 2 above the report mark, and that goes into the report display 2 column, and the report display 2 column is what is referenced on the report, and it is labeled as term 2 final. In the case of where you split the class mark and you have actually 3 columns on the report, I'm going to show you a report example like that now, and you have the report display 2, in other words you put a 2 above the class mark, that goes into what was traditionally the term 2 column. Then you have an exam mark which goes into the report display 5 column in FrontOFFICE, which as I say was traditionally the term 5 column. Those columns are still referenced on your reports. Is 2 and 5, and those are the 2 marks that come through, and then you weight it in set classes, and I'll take you to that now as we go through the tutorial. You weight it in set classes in order to arrive at the final year-to-date mark, which that column is then labeled term 2 final, and it's a calculated field, uses a calculation in FrontOFFICE that's existed from the beginning of time. That looks at the year weighting in set classes. So we'll use the example that we just did previously to this tutorial, which was the grade 7 home language. But again, you can apply this across to any of the other subjects, and in fact many of the other subjects are simpler in the sense that it's easier to negotiate what the exam mark is. In other words, they write an exam, and what the class mark is. Okay, so firstly I'm just going to quickly show you a report that is an example of how the mark is split into term 2 and 5, or report display 2 and 5, and comes out with a final term 2 mark as a calculation. So the report you see in front of you is a classic example of this. So they have a field called CAS, or class mark, used to be called CAS, same thing. They have a field called exam, and they have a term mark, which was the final term mark. If we actually go into the design of this thing, you will see that it references the field called term 2. As I say, the reference, the field itself is still called term 2, but it's labeled report display 2 in your marks and comments and in other areas of FrontOFFICE. And as I've explained in previous tutorials, we'll start to get used to the idea of referring to them as report display marks as opposed to term 1 to 4 in the traditional sense, because there's actually 12 mark entry points now in FrontOFFICE that can be weighted in various ways to arrive at your marks. This being one of the examples, and there is your exam mark that goes into the term 5 column, or report display 5, and the calculation field in FrontOFFICE is a thing called Marks6P, and what it does is it takes the mark for term 2 or report display 2, multiplies by the weighting which is set in set classes, which we'll cover now, and it takes the term 5 mark and multiplies by its weighting, and it then divides by the sum of the weighting and comes out at a thing called Marks6P, which is your year-to-date mark for term 2. Now if we return to the mark sheet example, so what you're going to do now, essentially you could see in the formula that we built, we had the 3 tasks. Okay, there was task 1, which was weighted 30, and if you actually go to SASAMS, we can check this as well. There was the first task weighted 30, there's the second task weighted 30, and there is the third task weighted 40. Now the third task are your exams. Okay, so in this sense we can see that the exams are weighted 40%, all right, this last component, and the rest of the term, the CAS mark, or class mark, is weighted 60%. Okay, so that's a ratio of 60 to 40, which is the same as 6 to 4, which is the same as 3 to 2, and you'll see why that is relevant when it comes to the year weighting in front office, because for those of you who've been with us for a long time, you'll understand that we always see these things. It's just a ratio. People like to work to ratios out to being a total of 100 because it makes it easier to understand, but at the end of the day, 3 to 2 is the same as 60 is to 40. Again, you'll see what I mean just now. So, well, in a sense, if you take this report mark, now what's going to happen is this report mark, essentially, if you're doing it this way, it basically becomes not debunked, but irrelevant in a sense, because it doesn't actually push through to anywhere. It's not going to push through to front office, because front office is going to determine the mark based upon the class mark and the exam mark, and front office and SAMS is going to determine its own mark as well. But it is useful to have the formula on there anyway, one, for display purposes for the staff, and two, I'll show you how you can actually use the formula to quite easily generate the class mark and the exam mark. Okay, so what I'll do is I've been testing on this first one, so I'll use this second bit as an example. So what I did was I basically just took this third segment, which I knew was the 40% of the mark, okay, copied it, okay, let's press enter, and I went in here and pasted the formula in. But however, this was weighted to its 40% constituency, or component should I say, whereas now I want the mark to display as a mark out of 100. So I'm going to remove the need for it to be weighted to 40, so it's going to show as a mark out of 100. The mark will transfer to front office as a mark out of 100, and then it gets weighted in front office as its 40% component, or as I said before, 2 out of 5. And again, we'll show you what I mean when we get to that point. And of course you can leave the round function in there. Let me just make sure I got it right. Yes. Okay, and now for this second part, or for the class mark, you are requiring the 2 marks that make up 60% of the mark. Okay, so again, I can basically take this first segment, but it's going to change slightly. All right, in the sense that now you'll see by multiplying it by 30 and multiplying it by 30, you're going to get a mark out of 60, which is not what we want. We want a mark out of 100. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take the 30 out and multiply it to a mark out of 100. So what you're saying now is that each test, okay, which is test 1 and test 2, are being turned into marks out of 100 first, okay, and then they're going to simply be divided by 2 because they're weighted 30% and 30%. In other words, they carry an even relevance, if you like, or weighting. Even though one's out of 10 and one's out of 45, bear in mind that as a task they're weighted 30 to 30, so they actually carry an even weighting. So you can simply divide them by 2, and then and then what you can do is you can round that to a decimal of 2, so put the round function, open brackets, comma at the end, 2, and just on a side note, I'd noticed, and I've put this in the email, I have noticed every now and again people are getting issues with a comma, and that is because in their regional settings they have got list separator in the regional settings, additional settings. They've got list separator set to a colon, and in some case even a decimal set to a comma. The list separator should be a comma, and the decimal symbol should be a dot point, just as a side note. Okay, and that will give you the class mark out of 100. Now, just to do a side calculation here, so that you can see the side calculation as to what will happen in front office. What front office will do is it'll take this mark and multiply it by 3, and it'll take this mark and multiply it by 2. okay, because remember we said that the class mark counts 40%, which is 40 out of 100, and the exam mark counts 60%, which is 60 out of 100. Okay, and 40 out of 100, 40 is to 60 out of 100 is the same as 4 is to 6. All right, it's just the ratio, which again, if you use the lowest common multiple, whatever it is, I forget my grade 3 maths, it is the same as 2 is to 3. So what you can do is multiply that by 2, multiply by that by 3, add them together, and divide by the sum of the weighting. Okay, so I've already done that in this segment, so we'll go, so you can see, okay, equals that multiplied by 3, okay, close that, plus, plus that multiplied by 2, okay, and we divide the whole thing. You don't have to do this on the mark sheet. Again, folks, I'm just showing you what happens in front office. And you'll see that the mark comes out to exactly what the ultimate report mark would be showing in SAMS. So your final year-to-date mark in front office is still going to match SAMS because we followed the same mathematical principles through. So just to go through to front office side, okay. So in your front office side, you would say, this in particular was dealing with grade 7 Afrikaans, or home language, should I say. In this case, they only have 1 for this grade. Okay, and the weighting is currently set to 0001. So what they're needing to do is to go to weighting, all right, and add a weighting, which they have here, of 0, which I've done, should I say, 03002. In other words, remember the report display 2 mark and the report display 5 mark are the marks in question. The report display 2 mark is multiplied by 3, the report display 5 mark is multiplied by 2. They're added together and divided by the sum of the weighting, which is 5, which keeps the integrity of the mark and enables it to come out exactly as required. Okay, so ignore that. That's data sets old that I'm working with. Okay, so again, we filter on grade 7 home language. Okay, and you simply change the weighting to be the weighting. Okay, you might have more than one class for this in your grade. You do it for all of the classes within that grade, and it doesn't necessarily mean that this weighting carries through for all of the subjects. Okay, you might have, let's say you have a technology subject where you have the PAT and you have the exam, and the PAT is 30, and so you only have 2 columns, and the PAT is 30 and the exam is 70. Well, you're going to put the class mark is going to simply, you don't even have to have a formula, you can just say equals the PAT mark divided by, I say you have a simple formula just to work out the percentage for that test. But what I mean is you're not including multiple columns. So you'd have the PAT mark as that divided by that multiplied by 100, and that would be your class mark. And your exam mark would simply be equal the second column, which was the mark divided by the total multiplied by 100. And let's say, as I say, the PAT was 30 and the exam was 70. Then in front office, your weighting is going to be 03007, okay, because that is the weighting between the PAT, or so-called class mark, and the exam mark. Okay, so I will be doing more examples of this, but that was just a brief introductory tutorial based on what you're going to be doing if your report is laid out as I explained, in terms of a report display 2 mark and a report display 5 mark, and your term 2 mark being a year-to-date calculation. Remember that you will be putting a class mark in, that is a mark out of 100, putting a 2 above, an exam mark in, putting a 5 above, and then just ensuring that your weighting in front office follows the correct principle that SAM is using between its class mark and its exam mark so that you arrive at the same mark. Thank you. Bye.